to know that he was providing his own car to bring people and drop people, requesting many other administrators that please provide some facilities for my resource persons. I asked him one question, why are you doing this? He said, sir, you know that I want that they should, if they have come here for the orientation program or workshop program, they should learn something. So why not the best people should be invited? Now what is the motive here? Now this administrator is acting not as an administrator, but the leader who is going to provide some learning platform to the people who have come to learn something. So what I think that as far as the management, school management is concerned, here the leadership and the leadership style has to be different. And that leadership style has to be the learning leadership style. But before I talk about the learning leadership style, let's concentrate the learning at two levels, that is called the individual leadership and the collective leadership. Now what is happening? Individual leadership in the mode of learning will be completely different from the collective leadership. Why? Because if I'm going to learn something individually now, and that's why I'm reminded of one beautiful article I read written by Rajni Kothari in the Politics of Knowledge, where he knows how to convert I knowledge into we knowledge. So similarly, now the teacher's job is whatever he has learned something, whether it is a new or not new, that's immaterial. That how to convert that I knowledge with the help of the students into we knowledge, and that we knowledge is going to be ultimately in the society will become the collective knowledge. So leadership, the learning leadership in terms of growth and development, not learning leadership in terms of power, position, hierarchy, and the money, and etc., etc. Similarly, I would like to, view school management and particularly leadership in the whole school scheme of school management as the creating individual learner and the community leader who is going to bring a kind of culture which you may call the learning culture in the society itself, which is ultimately going to affect the collectiveness of the mass. Now, what that collectiveness, the consciousness of the collective mass, how you are going to infect. I mean, just a small example I'll give you. Yesterday, when I was talking about, I mentioned the observation. Now, see the learning. If somebody is already in the culture of learning, today what has happened, I'm really moved by that particular thing. He happens to my teacher. He said, Arvindji, you said, I'm talking about Professor Krishna Kumar, you are talking about the number, the behavior of a particular number with respect to the operations of number. I have observed this. What's your observation? You know, you do this kind of survey, you will find hardly 1% among the educated people have this learning zeal that at this time also I'm going to learn. So I find the learning leadership, this is what is to be inculcated among the students as well as among the teachers, and teachers themselves should perceive as the learner, all right? So what I would like to conclude that, why to learn? To learn to think on their own. Why to think on their own? So that they can take charge of their own life, and individually, collectively, and ultimately, what Sri Aurobindo talks about, the cosmically. This is what I had to say. Thank you so much.
For science, what is the role of advisors, which I have always depended on, and so on and so forth. So actually, I don't have all that much to contribute to this question. All I can do is to relate the topic of this session to what we have been discussing in the last 1.5 days. Namely, we want certain changes to happen, particularly in the way in which teachers understand their job and the way in which they do their job in the classroom, how they relate to children, how they perceive knowledge. These are the issues we have been discussing. So if these issues now are picked up by the administration, and the administration would like to then start executing this vision or put it into reality, and the principles are going to be the medium, the vehicle of this execution. So the primary question that emerges is how, to what extent is the principal going to be convinced of uh, the new approaches we want to see followed by teachers? That's number one. His or her own, how do we develop his or her own conviction that this indeed is worth doing? And secondly, if that works out through whatever means, the administration here will have to work out ways in which principals come on board, as we say, this nice English phrase. It's very interesting. You know, yes, here is a ship, we want to float it in whatever health it is, and now we want the principals to come on board. So what story do we tell them to convince them that what the administration has decided is indeed positive, it's a good direction to take, and these are the things that now will have to happen? That is number one issue. And the second issue is then, how does the principal convince the teacher that these are the directions that are worth following, intrinsically worth following? Not because somebody up there has decided it on the basis of the advice of X, Y, and Z, and so on, but by creating sufficient logic, sufficient reason for the teacher to feel, yes, this looks like a good idea, and it's worth my effort to try this idea. Both in terms of whether it's in pedagogic terms or in terms of my perception of, let's say, what is language or what is mathematics and so on. The principal's job is very critical. To first himself or herself get convinced, and then to convince the teacher to move towards these objectives. And after the selection, how do you orient the principal into a certain perception of what it is to manage schools, what it is to manage people, basically, people who are themselves highly educated and so on. So all of that I leave aside. I hope that the recruitment process will not be so simplistic as it is in government schools and in any state of the country, or in the Kendriya Vidyalaya Sangathan. And these are not particularly great examples to follow. The treatment of the principal by the administration, that also is a very major question I don't want to get into, because there again the KV system is a very bad example to follow, because the KV system just doesn't allow the principal the space to think on his or her own and do things. It's a very tightly organized system across the country. Among the private schools, the few that I have seen, there is more space in some of them, but I think for the Tibetan administration here to decide how they want to recruit, train the principal, orient the principal, how they want to treat the principal, how do they want to make the principal understand what the issues are, etc. All of that, I think, is a very complex subject, and I don't want to spend this time on that exercise. I think very briefly what I would like to say is that if we can, if we want to create a new sort of culture of administration in our Tibetan schools here, I know they are running at different levels of quality. There are some very good schools, and there are these new schools which are now coming into the administration's hands, and there are some other schools of different levels of problems and qualities. So there can't be a single policy on board. We have to be capable of differentiating, etc. But I think the issues that will definitely come to the fore if our goal is to create a new culture of functioning in schools, if our goal is to create a new ethos, then it's very clear the principal is going to have a role. I think the crux of that issue is something which is actually a culturally embedded issue. Administration in any country or in any city or in any village is affected by the culture of the society that surrounds it. And in our situation, and I'm talking now as an Indian, I can tell you that the one thing that the administrator has to be prepared for is that he has to know the details of all the jobs to be done and not merely the names of the jobs to be done. if there's a program that you're going to organize, it's important for you to keep in mind that perhaps it'll be a good idea just to visit the toilet before the VIP comes. Although the job has been assigned to somebody, but it's important for you to elevate that job to that level where the director also knows that, there's an important thing I wanted to keep in mind. How the mics are working, whether there is soap in the, toilet, whether there is, where will this happen? If a classroom is to be organized, there are 1,000 details to be looked at. One of my most moving experience of meeting a headmistress comes from a school in Lahore, in Pakistan, where we were taken by the government, of course, to understand how a system which the Lahore municipality had put in place to completely prohibit beating of children. So we were taken to this primary school, and this headmistress met us, and I asked her point blank. I said, do you really believe that it's a good idea? And she asked me, she said, sir, you are an educationist, you tell me, should the children be afraid at all, or should they not be afraid? These officers are saying they should not be afraid of me at all, and I'm trying to do my best. So I could see that she's a thoughtful person who had not just borrowed the policy but was thinking about it. And it was a new policy, it was still evolving how to manage. But then I said, can you take me around your school yourself? Show me what's going on here. It was a small school in a very congested part of Lahore. I must tell you, it was so moving when she told me that I see when I come every day, I make sure that the jali in the windows doesn't have dust. She said, if I don't see it, then I know number of people are going to ignore that. Because I like to keep this school clean. And they keep the floors clean because they know that's everybody sees it. But they don't worry about the jali and under the doors there are spaces where my eye goes, and then it happens. And I said, my God, this is the kind of level of concern for details that makes a great administrator, whether it's working on a school or as in a very high level organization. Because it's true that functions are differentiated. These are modern institutions. Everybody has to do his own job. And of course, ideal situation is that everybody should do his job and understand. But that ideal situation works only if everybody loves his job and everybody sees dignity in that job. But we live in a society whose culture is based on the idea that only certain functions have dignity and certain other functions don't have dignity. And you do those functions because you can't do anything better. And so many functions of a school, particularly functions of this kind, like maintaining sanitation, maintaining a good environment in terms of how things are placed, whether things are sent back to the places every day after use, how paper is utilized, how water is utilized in the school. All of these are so many things which are culturally being shaped in Indian schools in a manner which is totally against the principles of education. Our schools are very rarely functioning as efficiently managed infrastructures. Infrastructure is there, it's not used, or if it's used, it's only used once in a while, or if it's used with certain kind of fear. This is true of educational technology, library, laboratories, hostels, so on and so forth. 10,000 things you can name. And you will see that a principal's job can be very, very frustrating because many people at different levels of authority in that school they don't see their function as being valued by the larger society. So they develop cynicism, and not surprisingly, they have every reason to be cynical. In a society where, cleanliness was something advocated by no less a man than Gandhiji. But nobody continues to, nobody sees it. In the same visit to Pakistan, in fact, I had asked my children in another school, to write a short essay for me. And about my idea of Pakistan. And when I read those essays, on one of these essays, I wrote a whole chapter in a book. This class 9 girl, she wrote in her essay that sometimes when I see litter on the streets of Lahore, I wonder whether this is what Qaeda-e-Azam had in mind when he fought for Pakistan. that we should have such a messy country. But I mean, frankly, Pakistan is much cleaner than India. And this is not something that only Queen Elizabeth II said. You can see this when you go yourself in buildings and everywhere. There's a culture of maintenance. But even then, this girl saw this question in terms of her political understanding of what Jinnah had wanted. I don't know if in my last 30 or 40 years of teaching, have I ever met a child or a teacher who thought that Gandhiji would be embarrassed if he came to our institution and visited the toilet. And Gandhi spent many decades of his life worrying about nothing else but toilets as the central problem of Indian society. So the principal has to be somebody who understands this larger culture in which he has to function. With teachers, with other support staff, with various other, you can say, requirements which are not directly academic in that sense that they are involved in, but which create enabling conditions in which children can develop a positive attitude to life, a healthy attitude towards life. And that means that the entire structure, entire infrastructure has to treat itself like a pedagogic infrastructure. Even toilets are there. Toilets, in fact, are top end for India. Toilets are the places where our children feel that education has no meaning. Because at the highest levels you find toilets dysfunctional. And Government of India has spent literally billions now on improving school toilets. Samfeji knows better than I do how much UNICEF has done. And yet those toilets don't have water. Principal will tell you, sir, it was constructed in a way that there's no point giving water here. Or if there is water, it's not managed, and so on and so forth. I mean, these are very typical problems, and the principal's attention has to go into all the problems, including the ones which are being managed by people with very limited understanding of the larger goals of what we want to achieve in terms of Tibetan identity, goals of sustaining this long-term desire for change with patience, with endurance. All of this will require a lot of thinking about details. And that is where I think the question for the principals is going to be, because the principal can't do it alone. He can't, like this headmistress of Pakistan who has a small school, principals can't see everything what's happening in hostel rooms, what's happening on roof, and so many equipments now. The principal has to create a culture of worrying about details in the mind of every functionary, all the teachers too. And that's where pedagogic reform comes into place. That, when I speak to a teacher, when I work out, give a feedback on a teacher's or on a child's homework, what do I write? These are matters of small details that go a long way in creating in the child a feeling that this world is an orderly place. And here I can grow up with some trust, with some kind of sense of an ideal, and so on. To convince a modern child who is living in a world where all the news is of corruption, where every day you have television shows where people don't allow the other person to finish his sentence, where the highest body, legislative body, is dysfunctional virtually, session after session. The children are used to ecological disasters all around. Such a child has to be treated with great care by all functionaries of a school to develop some remedy for this cynicism which all other agencies of society are determined to create in the child's mind. So the principal has a very important responsibility to, first of all, understand what is needed, why it is needed, not just because it's an order from the administration that now it's needed. He has to be convinced that it's needed. And then she has to convince her colleagues that this indeed is needed. And sometimes you, of course, do meet people like that who work out details, who are 24 hours busy and really have no time, which is true. A good principal has absolutely no time because there's just so much to be done. So the ideal principal is somebody who doesn't do anything himself, but creates a culture in which all these priorities are picked up by others, and then she becomes a symbol of all those ideals. And she is busy meeting. I mean, organizing meetings is the loveliest job of an administrator, I must tell you. When you have a meeting, people, if you can actually manage people to use meetings to come together, to understand things, and at the end of the meeting, work out what has to be done and within what time frame, and work out that kind of detail, then half your job is done. But I think this requires a considerable amount of training, orientation, especially if the Tibetan schools are trying now for some change based on their policy. Then orienting the new principle or the existing principles for a change-oriented school has to be spelt out with all the details worked out how that communication is to go. Because normally the principal is seen as somebody who has to maintain the school somehow. Administration in India, thanks to our bureaucracy, has become synonymous with maintenance of status quo. It's not, I mean, that's what officers will tell you, that I don't want trouble. So long as I'm here, I don't want any trouble. And then, of course, next year I'll retire. So in the meanwhile, I don't want any trouble. And change, everybody knows, does bring some trouble. Change means that you meet unforeseen circumstances. So the principal's orientation that the administration will do for this, this recipe of change which the advisory committee is offering, I think is going to be absolutely crucial, and it's something very exciting to watch as an advisor. Thank you.
On this, our friend Sampe.
I'm just trying to connect the bits because we've had all of this discussion. What's emerged is a kind of a consensus, I think, around what kind of education we're seeking to ensure in these spaces. So then the question is, what is that administrative setup? What is that, who are the actors who are critical to help create and maintain that space, albeit with both with the administrative tasks, which feed into this, as well as the education leadership. And I think for the DAO, one of the things they have to do fundamentally is they're going to have to take a very cold, hard look at who's on board now, because you work with what you have. And you may not have the luxury of recruiting new folks, so then you have to the rollout of the strategy for reform. So what you actually need is you need to find those champions within the setup. Within the setup, the best kind of way to do it is if you give a bunch of principals in schools and say, here's the vision. It's all done, mate. Off you go and actualize it. Then you get, and in the context of a very authoritarian culture, which both in the host country and ourselves. I mean, we are just coming out of feudalism ourselves. The democratic culture is slowly being developed. It's a progress. It's a march. We ain't there yet by a long shot. So I think, if that's the kind of reality, then we have to say, what are the transitional steps that we're going to and the thing with change is, having done change, people are afraid of it too. So until they can see how does it strengthen me, benefit, whatever, they do this kind of analysis themselves. So the critical thing is to bring sooner rather than later into the conversation experienced teachers, head teachers, and particularly if you know that you're going to face very strong because we're only dealing with a number of schools, the characters. If there are influentials, there may be not influential in the organogram, but they're influential in that they influence other people. You need to connect with them early rather than later and make sure that they're part of a very vigorous give and take. You almost have to lock the door to the meeting room and say, listen, 3 days we're sitting here and we're not leaving till we get consensus on a way forward, and deal with a lot of that. And that's just the beginning, because then the others, then they have to go out and, I'm saying this because if it comes down as a series of edicts from the DOE or whatever, you'll be gamed, let me tell you. All the outward signs of compliance will exist. The reports will come duly. But what will happen, the old pedagogy will continue to predominate. And if you go to inspect, they'll do, I'll tell you a funny story. When I was in Turkmenistan, because it's a very Soviet culture still, and we were promoting this critical thinking. And they're very difficult. which is sorry, what can I say? But that's what we were promoting, you know. So I go to the school, and the head teacher is very proud and said, Mr. Santa, you know, you will see today how our students are taking this critical thinking and into a new dimension. I thought, oh my gosh, this in a country where just like, you know, the Soviet model with the old, you wear a black suit, you sit very still, and this is a good student, you know. Don't make a noise, don't shuffle your feet. So I go there and said, what are they going to discuss? The life of Monet. I thought, my gosh, Monet. I mean, wow, you know, incredible. So one student gets up and Monet was born in France and and he began this art. Sat down. Okay. Then the next one got up. Next 2 paragraphs, they'd mugged up from the internet or something. They'd mugged up his biography. There was no question, no answer. And then the teacher turns to me, isn't this amazing? Now, in their mind, they were convinced that they were doing this kind of, discussion and debate. And I guess it was a little bit of a departure from a lecture, but really it wasn't much of a departure, you know. And so I don't know who was fooling who, whether I was fooling them or they were fooling me. But you know, it's one of those awkward social situations where you sort of make polite noises and leave, because you know. But that said, I think so. I think you really need to look very much at how you roll it out and how you enroll people into this process. And people have, and teachers and others have to see that, that there is some, that it will optimize something for them. Sometimes what happens is, if people have been doing things in a certain way and they've been alienated from their work a bit, when you get them into this new environment where suddenly they start to feel that it's meaningful, you actually do see, and I have in instances seen, as one teacher said in Bangladesh to me, you know, sir, before you came, all of you with active learning, he says, you told me this Nach Gan. I thought, what is this? You know, you're making monkeys out of us, you know. You want me to do Nach Gan. But once I started doing it, sir, he said, the students reacted to me differently. And now he was about 52, he said, I'm happy to come to school and do Nach Gan. And you know, what he meant was active teaching, using his body, using elements, and engaging the students, you know. He told us anyway, he said, I'm so happy. I'm happy to come to school. But that man, initially, very difficult for him, because it went against everything he'd been taught and how he himself was taught, you know. And then the parents came and said, sir, what is this? You're jumping up and down. There's noise in the classrooms. People are moving around. I mean, is this in school? I mean, the village head came and complained that this is not education. This is some tamasha going on here. But after a couple of months, when the children started to come home and they were more, then, so you have to convince the parents also, and it's not easy, because it's the same thing with corporal punishment, you know. I was just in 80, and they beat in front of me. They're using big belt, you know. It's part of the social thing. So I asked a program officer at UNICEF. I said, so how do we stop this? She said, well, you know, in our culture, it's accepted. I mean, if the program officer of UNICEF is telling me, and I said, look, you're a program officer for UNICEF, we're a children's organization. We can't be for any kind of corporal punishment. But she said, the parents will complain. The parents will complain if you don't beat the child, because that's a form of classroom management. You know. So these are the challenges, I think. So what I guess to summarize what I'm saying is, you've got to look at your stakeholders, and they're not simply the school people. They're not you've got to look at the teachers, you've got to look at the administrators, you've got to look at the parents, and even within community, if you're living in a kind of community, there are influential people in the community whose voice counts, in the sense that, oh, bekar ka cheez ho raha hai. Oh, they came and you know, nothing's going on there now. This change is no good. That's the corrosive, because that enters the consciousness of the community. And that undercuts, that cynicism is like a, acid, just wears away. But otherwise, it's terribly exciting. I mean, I think it, and the positioning is important, So positioned as something that's coming also from the teachers. So teachers and the head teachers must have. And the last thing I want to say is, if you want to do all this change, you have to look at the job description. Because in the end, we all work in bureaucracies. You have to also look at the job description. Because the first thing you'll get is, they'll say, it's not in my JD. My JD says I've got to do X, Y, Z, and you ask me to do these other things. So you have to do the homework, and you have to make sure that the JDs reflect this new reality that you want them to do. And then you have to have some indicators. Those are just ways you manage things. That's all. Thank you.
I would like to, of this for the school management, the leading school change, the column 5. One of I want to start with a very beautiful memory of a small boy who's in about 8, I think must be about 10-year-old child. And in a train station in Chennai, I was in the university, I was going by the train, and he was caught for not keeping his school pass, and he didn't have a ticket. And so he didn't buy a ticket, nor he had a pass in his hand. So the TTR, the ticket controller, caught him by collar. And he caught him by collar and made him walk with him. He would have just made him walk for about 10 steps. By the time, this boy just opened his button 1, 2, 3 and left his hand, and left the shirt in the TTR's hand, and he flew away. This always remained in my mind as one of the most creative exercises of a child. And even today, whenever I'm passing by a train station, I'm looking for a child. And so I put this in the perspective of discipline and indiscipline. What is creativity and what is violence and things. So then, after many years, then I was asked to go and look after the Hindu College hostel, and which had about 250 boys and between 17 to 28, and a very difficult job, because they're all very good in the morning, and in the night they are different. And so I had about this a boy coming from Meerut, and a very good person, and so he used to kind of get into one or other accidents after drinking, and so he used to be in medicine, drugs, and he had to come out, and then about immediately we had to take him to the hospital. So I asked him about tell me something about your school, and what were you doing? He said, sir, I really enjoyed my school, and only thing is that often I used to have problems with my teacher, but they used to punish me. And I said, what kind of things that you used to do? So he narrated an incident about his chemistry laboratory class. So he didn't like his chemistry teacher, so he carried a frog and put it in a tube. And then then the teacher caught him, asked him that,